Have you ever felt as if your own mind was against you, as if there was a silent voice repeating scenarios that never happened, but that nevertheless steal your peace? That strange feeling that arises in the middle of the night when everything is silent, but inside you there is a constant noise, a thought that comes and goes, creating fears that seem too real to ignore. And the more you try to control it, the more it seems to escape, as if there is something invisible shaping your thoughts without asking permission. Time slows down in these moments. 1 second seems too long. Breathing changes. The heart accelerates for no apparent reason. The mind creates images, dialogues, situations. And all of this begins to seem true. Fear does not scream, it whispers. He doesn't push, he convinces. And before you know it, you're already trapped inside a cycle that repeats itself day after day, night after night. A tiredness that is not physical but spiritual. A restlessness that no one sees but that you feel deeply. But what if this scenario is not the end of the story? What if there is something that has always been within your reach, but that you have never been taught to use correctly? Something simple, seemingly common, but which carries a hidden power capable of interrupting this cycle inside your mind. A spiritual key that is not far away, is not hidden in unreachable places, but that remains invisible to those who have never been taught to see. There is a breaking point, a moment when everything can change, not gradually, but from the inside out. Because what's at stake isn't just what you feel, it's how you think. And when the structure of the mind changes, fear loses the place it once occupied. There is a path little talked about, almost forgotten, but extremely real. And it doesn't depend on circumstances, it depends on access. The Bible states in Isaiah 41:10, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I strengthen you and help you and uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness." These words are not just comfort, they are a spiritual code, and today something profound begins to be revealed. It's not theory, it's not passing motivation. It is something alive, and those who stay until the end will understand why certain fears never went away, and what can finally break them. And along this journey, you will realize something that may never have been explained in this way. God does not only act around you, He acts within your mind, in the exact place where fear is born. Each passage, each story will reveal how real men and women faced suffocating thoughts, deep crises, and moments of despair. And yet, they were transformed by a divine intervention that began from the inside out. You will understand how to identify the root of fear, how it settles, and above all, how it can be broken. In 2 Timothy 1:7 it is written, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind." And if that truth starts to make sense within you today, something already starts to change. If this message speaks to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this can reach other people who are also struggling in silence. There is something that almost no one realizes, but that completely changes the way of understanding fear. It has not always been part of the human mind. In the beginning, before any fall, before any rupture, man lived in absolute peace, without anxiety, without insecurity, without that inner weight that seems so common today. And then something happened, something silent but devastating. The connection with God was broken, and at that very moment, something new was born within the human mind. When Adam said, "I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself," Genesis 3:10, he was not just describing an emotion. He was revealing a profound spiritual change. For the first time, the man felt fear. For the first time, he wanted to hide. And that didn't happen because the environment changed. It happened because the perception of God's presence was lost. Notice this carefully. The fear did not start on the outside. It started inside the mind. The garden was still there. The creation was still perfect. But something inside him had broken. The absence of awareness of God's presence has made room for thoughts that have never existed before. Insecurity, shame, guilt. All of this came in like a silent avalanche. And that's exactly how fear still works today. He doesn't need proof. He just needs space. It grows when the mind disconnects from the truth. It is strengthened when God's presence is no longer perceived in everyday life. And without realizing it, the person starts to hide too. Not behind trees, but behind distractions, silence, isolation, thoughts that are never confronted. But there is something powerful in that very moment. Because even after the fall, God did not quietly depart. He called, he went after it. This reveals a principle that many overlook. God begins the process of restoration in the very place where the fear began. He does not ignore the wounded mind. He enters it with truth. That changes everything. Because if the fear was born out of a spiritual disconnection, then healing cannot be just emotional or rational. It needs to be spiritual too. It's not just about controlling thoughts. It is about restoring awareness of God's presence within the mind. And when that awareness starts to come back, something starts to break. Those thoughts that seemed so strong begin to lose strength. That constant feeling of alertness begins to subside, because the mind, little by little, stops operating based on fear and begins to align with presence. Maybe you've never looked at fear that way. Maybe it always seemed like something normal, part of life, impossible to change. But what if the root is deeper than you imagined? And if what you feel today started much earlier? And can it be broken in a way you've never tried? If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, perhaps it is because God wanted you to hear it today. Don't ignore this touch on your heart. If you felt something, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of a big change. There is a type of fear that does not scream, does not paralyze in an obvious way, but silently limits all decisions. It is the fear of not being enough. And he disguises himself so well that he often seems humble, seems prudent, even seems like wisdom. But deep down, it's a prison built inside the mind. Gideon lived just like that. He wasn't just physically hidden, threshing wheat in the winepress to get away from enemies. He was hiding inside himself, trapped in a distorted view of who he was. And then something unexpected happens. God does not come confirming Gideon's feelings, does not validate his insecurity, does not reinforce the image he had of himself. On the contrary, God completely breaks that internal narrative with a statement that seems, at first glance, disconnected from reality. In Judges 6:12 it is written, "Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor.'" Valiant man. How could someone hidden, insecure, and full of doubts be called that? This is where something profound begins to be revealed. God does not speak based on what Gideon feels. God speaks based on what he has already established. Fear builds a false identity based on experiences, traumas, comparisons, and failures. But God confronts this identity directly, bringing a truth that the mind cannot yet fully grasp. Notice the invisible confrontation that happens at this moment. On the one hand, a mind conditioned by fear, repeating, I can't, I'm not capable. On the other side, the voice of God declaring just the opposite. And transformation doesn't start when circumstances change. It begins when the mind decides which voice to believe. Gideon questions, hesitates, tries to argue. This shows something important. Hearing the truth does not mean accepting it immediately. There is a process. But God stands firm, leading Gideon step by step, breaking down every layer of insecurity until that limited mind begins to align with divine truth. And perhaps this is the most delicate point of all, because fear is not only in what you face, but in the way you see yourself in the face of it. How many times have you diminished yourself inside? How many times have you thought that you were not capable, that you were not prepared, that you did not have what was necessary? These thoughts don't come out of nowhere. They are built, repeated, strengthened over time. But just as with Gideon, God does not negotiate with this limited version. It calls for what you can't yet see. He declares something about you that may never have crossed your mind. And that's exactly when the fear starts to lose strength. When the truth begins to occupy the space that was previously dominated by doubt. If this word is awakening in you a deep desire to hear this voice above all others, comment right now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." Write it as an open prayer, an internal decision, and leave your like on this video, because it can bring that same truth to other people who are also stuck in thoughts that didn't come from God. There is a little talked about moment in spiritual life that confuses many people. That point when, even after a great victory, something inside begins to crumble. Elijah had just experienced one of the greatest miracles recorded in the scriptures. Fire descended from heaven, the impossible happened before everyone's eyes, and God's presence was unquestionably manifest. But soon after that, something unexpected happened inside him. A threat has arrived, a single message, and that was enough to completely shake the mind of someone who, until recently, was facing an extraordinary miracle. In 1 Kings 19:4 it is written, "Enough, O Lord, take my life now." How can someone who has seen so much power, who has experienced something so supernatural, get to that level of emotional exhaustion? The answer reveals something profound about the human mind. Fear does not respect past achievements. It can arise even after intense spiritual experiences, because he doesn't just feed on what happened, it feeds on how the mind interprets what is happening now. Elijah did not lose the power of God, but for a moment he lost his inner balance. And here's a detail that changes everything. God doesn't rebuke Elijah. God does not correct him harshly. He does not accuse him of being weak. God understands the state of his mind. Before any words, God allows Elijah to rest. It feeds, take care. It restores the physical before confronting the spiritual. This reveals a principle that many ignore. A tired mind becomes a breeding ground for fear. How many times have you felt this way? Not after a defeat, but after fighting so hard, winning something important, and still feeling an emptiness, a tiredness that is difficult to explain, as if something inside had lost its strength. This does not mean that you have gone backwards. It means that there is a part of your mind that still needs to be taken care of. After rest, God calls Elijah out of the cave, and then something powerful happens. It's not in the strong wind, it's not in the earthquake, it's not in the fire, but in a still, soft voice. God does not invade Elijah's mind with noise, he reconnects through calm. This shows that the healing of fear does not happen in chaos, but in stillness where God's voice can be heard again. And little by little, that tired mind begins to be repositioned. God reminds Elijah of the purpose, shows that he is not alone, reveals that there is still a way ahead. Fear begins to lose strength when the mind hears the right voice again. Maybe today you are exactly at that point, not at the beginning of the fight, but after having already faced a lot. If this makes sense within you, write in the comments a simple but faith-filled phrase, "God is still with me." Sometimes stating this is the first step for the mind to find rest again. There is a detail in this story that goes unnoticed by many people, but which reveals an uncomfortable truth. Being close to Jesus did not prevent the disciples from feeling afraid. They were in the same boat, in the same environment, looking at the same scenery. But when the storm started, something inside them collapsed. The wind picked up, the waves grew, the water began to invade the boat, and suddenly all they could see was the risk, the danger, the end. And the most intriguing thing is that Jesus was there the whole time, not absent, not distant, present. Even so, fear took over. This shows something that completely changes the way you understand this internal struggle. The presence of God around you is not automatically perceived within your mind. There's a difference between God being with you and you to be aware of it. In Mark 4:40, Jesus asks a question that crosses time. Why are you so timid? Do you not yet have faith? He's not just talking about courage in the face of the storm. He's revealing that the problem wasn't the wind nor the waves. It was the way their minds interpreted that situation. Fear grows when the mind loses the reference of who is in control. And at that moment, the disciples forgot who was in the boat. They looked at the storm and gave it more authority than the presence of Jesus. And maybe this happens more often than you think, not because God has left your life, but because in the midst of chaos, the mind begins to focus more on the problem than on the presence. Notice how subtle this is. Fear doesn't need God to be absent. It just needs you not to notice. It feeds on distraction, urgency, the pressure of the moment. It makes everything seem bigger, more intense, more urgent than it really is. And when you get into that state, your mind starts to react as if it's alone, even though it's not. But then something changes. Jesus gets up, rebukes the wind, talks to the sea, and immediately everything calms down. This was not just an external miracle. It was a show of authority, a reminder that even when the mind goes into chaos, there is someone in absolute control of everything. And this is where the breaking of fear begins. Not when the storm subsides, but when the mind recognizes who rules over it. When this awareness becomes real, something inside stabilizes, breathing changes, thoughts slow down, and despair begins to lose strength. Because you're no longer just looking at the problem, you're looking at who has power over it. If you are here so far, it is because this message is finding something within you that has perhaps been hidden for a long time. And this is not by chance. At the end of this path, there is a special moment prepared for you, a moment of prayer, of surrender, of realignment with God. So stay with me, because what is yet to be revealed can change the way you face everything that today seems bigger than you. There is something curious about David's story that often goes unnoticed. The giant he faced did not begin on the outside. It began inside the minds of everyone around him. Goliath had been there for days, affronting, threatening, intimidating. But what really paralyzed the army was not the size of the giant. It was the effect it had within them. Fear had already won before the battle even began. And then David arrives. No armor, no military experience, no warrior looks, but with something that no one else had at that moment, a mind aligned with God's truth. While everyone saw an impossible problem, David saw an affront that could not remain. This reveals a powerful principle. The size of the giant does not determine the outcome. The way the mind sees is what defines the course of the battle. Before any stone was thrown, before any physical movement, David had already won internally. In Psalm 27:1 he declares, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" This is not a phrase said after the victory. It is a conviction that existed before it. And that's exactly what breaks the cycle of fear, a mind that takes a stand before circumstances change. But notice what happens along the way. David doesn't just face Goliath, he faces voices. His own brother tries to demotivate him. King Saul doubts him. The people around him can't see what he sees. This shows that fear also tries to infiltrate through opinions, looks, words that seem to make sense, but that carry doubt. How many times has this happened to you? It was not only the situation that brought fear, but what you heard, what you said, what you began to repeat within your own mind. And without realizing it, that giant began to grow not because he changed, but because his perception has changed. David breaks this cycle in a simple but profound way. He does not argue with fear. He does not negotiate with doubt. He remembers. It brings to mind what God has done before. He accesses past experiences with God to strengthen the present. This completely reorganizes the mind. The focus ceases to be the problem and returns to God's faithfulness, and it is at this point that something changes inside him. The fear does not disappear because the giant is gone. Fear loses strength because the mind is no longer overwhelmed by the threat. It is based on trust. And when this change happens from within, what seemed impossible begins to be faced with a different authority. Maybe your giant doesn't have a visible name, but you know exactly what it is. It's in the thoughts that come back, in the insecurities that insist, in the situations that seem bigger than you. But just like David, the real battle begins within the mind. And when that part is overcome, the rest begins to line up. Now state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write it as a spiritual act of surrender. And leave your like so that more people find this supernatural peace that comes from God. There is a kind of peace that makes no sense to those who look at it from the outside. A calm that does not match the scenario, a stability that defies logic. Daniel was thrown into a den full of hungry lions in an environment where any natural reaction would be panic, despair, screaming. But none of this defines his stance. What sustains Daniel in that moment is not the absence of danger, it is the presence of something much deeper within his mind. Because the real issue was never the size of the threat, but what was already built inside it before the threat arrived. Daniel did not begin to trust God inside the pit. He already had a lifetime of fellowship, spiritual discipline, constant prayer. His mind was already trained, strengthened, aligned. And that's exactly what many ignore. What you build in silence determines how you react in the moment of pressure. When the decree was signed forbidding prayer, Daniel did not change his behavior. He continued praying, as he always did. This reveals something powerful. His faith was not circumstantial, it was structural. It didn't depend on the environment, it didn't fluctuate with the risk. And when the most extreme moment came, when he was thrown into the pit, his mind didn't collapse, because it was already sustained by something greater than fear. In Daniel 6:23 it is written, "No mischief was found in him, because he had believed in his God." This phrase carries a deep secret. It doesn't say that the lions weren't there. It does not say that the danger has disappeared. He says that there was no damage because there was faith. This completely changes the perspective. Fear does not need to be eliminated by the environment. It is neutralized by the trust established within the mind. Now think sincerely. How has your mind been trained in ordinary days, in the moments when seemingly nothing is happening? Because it is in these periods that the internal structure is being formed, and when the pressure comes, there is no time to build, only to reveal what already exists. Many people want peace in the midst of the storm, but they don't build that peace before it comes. They want security in the midst of the crisis, but they do not nourish faith in quiet days. Daniel shows that there is a different way, a path where the mind is strengthened daily, silently, until fear no longer has room to dominate. And when that structure is in place, something extraordinary happens. The situation may even seem the same, the risk may even remain there, but the way you perceive it changes completely. The heart does not race as before, the thoughts do not become disorganized, the soul does not despair. Because there is a silent certainty underpinning everything. If this message is already touching something inside you, maybe it's not by chance. Maybe it's an invitation to start building that inner strength that no one sees, but that changes everything. And if you feel that this word has value, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This allows this message to reach others who also need to find that peace that does not depend on circumstances. There is a striking detail in this scene that often goes unnoticed. Peter did not sink immediately. He walked on water. For a few moments he lived the impossible, defied logic, completely broke through natural limits. This means that the problem was not in the beginning, was halfway there. It all started with a word. Jesus said, "Come." And while Peter kept his mind connected to that voice, something supernatural sustained every step. It wasn't about the water, it wasn't about his ability, it was about the direction he was going. His mind was aligned with the word he received, and that was enough to make the impossible happen. But then something changes. The scenery has not changed. The wind was already there before. The waves already existed. What has changed is the focus. In Matthew 14:30 it is written, "But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid." This is the exact point where everything begins to break down. Peter did not sink because the wind appeared. He sank because he began to pay more attention to him than to the voice that supported him. Notice how this happens in a subtle way. As long as the mind is focused on God's direction, there is stability. But when attention begins to divide, when eyes begin to interpret circumstances instead of staying in the Word, fear finds space. And fear doesn't need much. It grows from a simple deviation of focus. How many times has this happened to you? You started well, with faith, with confidence, believing that everything would work out. But along the way, something caught his attention. A problem, a piece of news, an unexpected difficulty. And little by little his mind began to leave the place of trust and enter a state of worry. Peter did not lose the ability to walk on water. He lost mental alignment with that which sustained that capacity. And this reveals a profound teaching. Fear does not only arise when something goes wrong. It arises when the mind begins to interpret reality without reference to God's voice. But even at this moment, there is something powerful. As Peter begins to sink, he cries out, and immediately Jesus stretches out his hand. This shows that even when focus is lost, there is still access, there is still an answer, there is still intervention. The point is never to lose focus. The point is to quickly notice when it strays and come back. Because as long as the mind is aligned, the environment doesn't have enough power to bring you down. This video came to you for a reason, and maybe while you were listening to this message, someone came to your mind, someone who is also facing their own fears, their own inner storms. Write that person's name in the comments. Let's create a chain of faith, where each name presented here will be an act of intercession, a step of trust that God can also reach and restore this life. There is a profound difference between trying to overcome fear and actually being transformed to the point where it no longer has dominion. Many people spend their lives fighting thoughts, trying to control emotions, looking for ways to calm down. But they are still stuck in the same cycle. Because the real problem is not just in what they feel, it is in the structure of the mind that has been formed over time. The Bible reveals something direct and powerful in Romans 12:2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This completely changes the approach. It's not about adjusting superficial behaviors. It's about an internal, continuous, deep renewal. The word transformed here carries the idea of complete change of form, as something that ceases to be what it was to become something totally new. And that is exactly what God does when he begins to act in the mind. It not only removes fear as if erasing a momentary symptom, it reconstructs the thought patterns that underpinned that fear. Those automatic thoughts, those negative interpretations, that tendency to always expect the worst. All of this is beginning to be replaced, but this renewal does not happen automatically. It is a process, a daily alignment. Each time you choose to believe truth instead of doubt, something within you is repositioned. Each time you decide to trust even without understanding, a new structure begins to form. And little by little, what once seemed natural, fear, insecurity, anxiety, begins to lose ground. The most interesting thing is that this transformation changes not only what you feel, but how you see everything around you. Situations that once caused despair are now seen more clearly. Thoughts that once dominated are now questioned. The mind ceases to be a constant battlefield and begins to become a place of stability. This does not mean that challenges cease to exist, but it does mean that you no longer react in the same way. There is a new basis, a new way of thinking, a new way of interpreting what happens. And that is liberating, because fear loses its strength when it no longer finds a structure to sustain itself. Perhaps you are now realizing that what God wants to do goes far beyond alleviating a difficult time. He wants to transform the way you think, how you react, how you live. And when this transformation begins, it reaches all areas of life. Nothing happens by chance. If you have come this far, it is because there is something being dealt with within you. And what still lies ahead can further deepen this transformation. Stay until the end, because God still has something specific to speak to your heart, something that can completely change how you face fear starting today. There is a kind of fear that comes not from what is happening now, but from what may happen later. It is the fear of the future, of what has not yet arrived, but which the mind insists on trying to control. And few stories reveal this as deeply as Joseph's. Because looking from the outside, everything in his life seemed to go wrong. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly accused, thrown into prison. Each step seemed like one more step toward failure. And that's exactly where fear tries to settle in more strongly, because when life gets out of control, the mind starts creating scenarios. What if nothing changes? What if it gets worse? What if that never makes sense? These thoughts do not appear by chance. They arise when we cannot see direction in the middle of the process. But there is something silent going on in Joseph's story that changes everything. God never stopped acting, even when he seemed absent. Behind the scenes, in every detail, in every invisible connection, there was a drive going on. Joseph couldn't see. He had no way of understanding at that moment, but each situation was being aligned with a greater purpose. This reveals a principle that directly confronts fear of the future. God doesn't start acting when you understand. He's already acting before you even know it. And while the mind tries to anticipate problems, God is already arranging solutions that are not yet visible. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph declares something that is only possible after a profound transformation. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. This sentence is not just a conclusion, it's a revelation. Joseph understood that even what seemed like destruction was being used as a building tool. Now think carefully. How many things today seem confusing, unfair, or even painful in your life? How many situations have you still not been able to understand? Fear of the future grows when the mind tries to interpret the present without considering the invisible action of God. Joseph could have become someone dominated by fear, stuck in the past, suspicious of everything and everyone. But something inside him was being shaped along the way. Even without answers, he remained faithful. Even without understanding, he kept moving forward. And it strengthened his mind in a way that fear no longer had room to dominate. There is a peace that is born when you understand that the future is not loose, it is not lost, it is not out of control. He is already being conducted. Even when it seems confusing, even when it doesn't make sense, there is a direction happening. And when that truth starts to enter the mind, something changes. Anxiety decreases, the need to control weakens, and trust begins to occupy a space that was previously dominated by fear, because you're no longer trying to predict tomorrow. You are learning to trust those who are already there. There is a type of fear that is even more silent and dangerous because it hides behind arguments that seem completely rational. It is not fear that screams, that paralyzes in an evident way. He is the one who whispers justifications, who presents apparently logical reasons for not moving forward. And that's exactly what happened to Moses. When God calls you, there is no doubt about the direction. There is no confusion about the purpose. The call is clear. But Moses' response does not come in the form of direct disobedience. It comes in the form of insecurity disguised as argument. In Exodus 4:10 he says, "Ah, Lord, I'm not eloquent. I am heavy in mouth and heavy in tongue." At first glance, this seems like just a real limitation being recognized. But in the depth, this reveals something greater, a mind trapped in its own incapacity. Moses was not lying. He really saw this difficulty in himself. The problem wasn't the limitation itself. It was to allow her to set the limit of what God could do through him. And here's a crucial point. Fear often uses logic to protect itself. He presents compelling reasons, builds solid arguments, makes it seem that backing down is the most sensible decision. How many times have you thought like this? I don't have enough preparation. I'm not good enough. It's not the right time. These thoughts seem prudent, they seem responsible, but deep down they may just be more sophisticated ways of fear remaining in control. God's response to Moses is direct and powerful. He does not deny the limitation, but neither does he accept it as an excuse. Instead, he reveals something greater than human weakness. God shows that ability does not come from man, it comes from him. That strength is not in natural ability, but in the authority he releases. This completely breaks the logic of fear, because if everything depended only on human capacity, fear would always have a reason to exist. There would always be a flaw, an insufficiency, a reason to retreat. But when God enters the equation, the reference changes. It's no longer about what you can do. It's about what he can do through you. And it is at this point that the mind begins to be transformed. When you stop seeing yourself only by your limitations and start considering God's action, something internal begins to reorganize itself. Insecurity loses strength, doubt begins to be confronted, and a new way of thinking begins to emerge. Moises had to go through this process. He resisted, questioned, tried to argue, but God stood firm, leading, showing, sustaining. And little by little, that man who saw himself as incapable became an instrument of something much greater than he himself could imagine. Maybe you're right at that point today. Not for lack of opportunity, but because you feel like you don't have enough inside you. But what if that's not the main issue? What if what's missing isn't capability, but how you're looking at it? That word didn't come to you by chance. God finds specific ways to reach the mind at the right time. If this touched something inside you, write in the comments, "I trust in God." May this simple statement be a real step of faith, even if silent but profoundly true. There is a time in life when fear does not come from a lack of direction, but from the size of the responsibility. Joshua was exactly in that place. He was not lost. He was not without purpose. On the contrary, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The problem was the dimension of what was in front of him, replacing Moses, leading an entire people, facing unknown challenges. All this pressed the mind in a silent but intense way, and it is in this scenario that God does not offer a suggestion, does not bring an alternative, does not present an optional plan. God gives a command. In Joshua 1:9 it is written, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid nor be dismayed. This completely changes the way we see fear, because here it is not treated as something inevitable or untouchable. It is confronted as a decision. This may seem strange at first glance. How can one simply decide not to fear? But what God is revealing is that the mind does not have to automatically submit to what it feels. There is a deeper choice going on. Fear may even arise, it may even try to take hold, but it does not have to govern actions. Joshua probably felt the weight, the responsibility, the pressure. But God did not tell him to wait for the fear to pass. God told him to move forward in spite of this. This reveals a powerful principle. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to obey, even when fear is present. And here is the point that transforms the mind. When you begin to rely not on emotions, but on the orders that God has already established, something within you is strengthened. Emotions are unstable, they change all the time, they are influenced by circumstances. But God's word stands firm. And when the mind anchors itself in that, it finds a solid foundation. How many times have you stopped moving forward because you expected to feel ready? I was waiting for confidence to appear, fear to disappear, security to arrive. But that moment never seemed complete. Josue shows that movement comes before sensation. The decision comes before the emotion. And as he goes forward, obeying, trusting, something begins to happen within. The mind adjusts to the movement. The force that seemed non-existent begins to emerge on the way. Courage doesn't come all at once. It is built with each step taken towards what God has already spoken. This completely changes the way we deal with fear. It is no longer a stop sign and becomes just a noise that no longer defines the course, because there is something bigger driving the decisions. Maybe today there is something in front of you that seems too big, too challenging, too heavy. And maybe your mind is waiting for the right moment to act. But what if the key isn't waiting, but obey what has already been placed in your heart? If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being aligned within you right now. And what still lies ahead can further deepen this transformation. Don't leave here now, because there is a word that can change the way you face everything that seemed impossible until now. There is a kind of fear that does not appear in words, but in silence. A fear that does not scream, but isolates. The woman of the bloodstream carried it inside her for years. It was not just a physical illness, it was a social mark, a condition that distanced her from people, that made her live on the margins, hidden, invisible. Each day was a constant reminder that something was wrong, that she couldn't get close, that she wasn't accepted. But the deepest was not in the body, was in the mind, because along with the pain came shame, and shame creates a different kind of prison. It makes the person believe that they cannot be seen, that they cannot expose themselves, that they need to hide so as not to be rejected. The fear, in this case, was not only of continuing to suffer, it was about trying and being exposed, about taking a step and being judged. And yet, something inside her began to move. It wasn't noisy, it wasn't visible to others, but it was decisive. She heard about Jesus, and within her arose a silent conviction. If I just touch your garments, I will be healed. This thought broke through an internal barrier, because until then everything in her told her to stay hidden. But now there was a faith that pushed her forward. Notice the intensity of this moment. She had no guarantee, no visible certainty, no support from the crowd. On the contrary, she was putting herself at risk by approaching. But the faith that was born within her was greater than the fear that bound her. And this is a powerful point. Transformation begins when something inside you speaks louder than everything that tried to silence you. She approaches in the middle of the crowd, perhaps with her heart racing, perhaps with thoughts trying to make her retreat. But it continues, and the moment he touches Jesus, something happens instantly, not only in the body, but in the soul. Because that touch wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. In Mark 5:34, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." He doesn't just recognize healing, he restores identity. Daughter, a word that breaks years of rejection, isolation, shame. And there, at that moment, it was not only the disease that was being cured, it was the mind that was being set free. This reveals something profound. Fear can imprison through shame, but faith has the power to break through that prison. And often, this process does not start with great actions. It starts with a silent decision, an internal step, a movement that no one sees, but that changes everything. Maybe there's something inside you that has been silenced for too long. Something you avoided, hid, ignored. But that is still there. And just like this woman, there is a moment when the decision needs to be made, not based on fear, but on the faith that begins to emerge, even if small. God has done things that often go unnoticed, but are profoundly real. And recognizing this is also part of the transformation. If you feel that somehow this word has touched something inside you, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple statement can be the beginning of a deliverance that you didn't even know you needed. There is a moment when fear ceases to be just a sensation and turns into conviction. It is no longer what if it goes wrong, but there is no other way. It is when the mind looks at a situation and concludes that it is over, that there is no way out, that nothing can be done. And it was exactly this scenario that God showed Ezekiel, a voucher, silent, dry, full of bones, scattered everywhere. There was no life, there was no movement, there was no possibility. It was the perfect portrait of what has already passed the point of restoration. And then comes the question in Ezekiel 37:3, Son of man, can these bones live? That question was not for God to get an answer. It was to confront Ezekiel's mind, because humanly the answer was obvious. No, they cannot. It's over. He is already dead. It has already been lost. And this is exactly how fear is strengthened, when the mind accepts a reality without considering the power of God, when what is visible becomes the only reference. But Ezekiel answers in a different way. Lord God, you know. He does not deny what he is seeing, but he also does not limit what God can do. And at that point, something starts to change. Because hope is not born from the situation. It is born from the realization of who God is. Then God begins to act, but in an unexpected way. It doesn't bring life instantly. He asks Ezekiel to prophesy. Let him speak. Let him declare. This reveals a profound principle. Reconstruction begins before visible transformation. It starts with the word, the direction, the spiritual alignment. And little by little, something impossible begins to happen. The bones move, connect, they create form. Then come the sinews, the meat, the skin. But there is still no life. This shows that there is a process. Not everything happens at once, but each step is led by God, even when it does not yet seem complete. How many times have you looked at something in your life and thought it was irreversible? A situation, a feeling, a phase, something that seemed to have already come to an end. Fear sets in exactly at this point, when the mind decides that there is nothing more to wait. But what this view reveals is that God does not work within the limits of human logic. He does not need there to be signs of life to start acting. He begins just where everything seems dead. And more than restoring the situation, he rebuilds the way you see. Because in the end, it's not just about the bones coming back to life. It is a mind that starts to believe again. A mind that stops being guided by what it sees and begins to align itself with what God can do. And when this change happens from within, fear loses its basis, because he no longer finds a mind that accepts the end as the final answer. He finds a mind that, even in the face of the impossible, still considers God's action. This word is not for everyone. If it has come to you, there is a purpose in it. Continue until the end, because there's something even deeper being prepared to play right where you need it most. There is a point in the spiritual journey that many do not expect to find, the moment when, even doing God's will, the pressure increases instead of decreasing. Paul lived just that. He wasn't out of purpose, he wasn't in doubt about what he needed to do, but even so, he faced constant persecution, threats, rejection. And it is in this type of scenario that fear tries to infiltrate silently. Because fear doesn't just appear when we're lost, it also arises when we know exactly what we should do, but the cost seems too high. The mind begins to calculate risks, to imagine consequences, to anticipate pain. And little by little, that internal question arises, is it worth continuing? In Acts 18:9-10, God responds directly to this point. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you. Notice the sequence. First, God confronts fear. Then it gives a clear direction. And finally, he reveals the reason, his presence. This shows that God does not ignore the pressure Paul was feeling, but neither does he allow her to determine the next step. The most interesting thing is that God does not promise that the persecution will end. He does not say that everything will be easy, that there will be no more opposition. Instead, he offers something much deeper, the certainty of constant presence. This completely changes the structure of the mind. Because fear loses strength not when the problem disappears, but when the person understands that they are not alone within it. Paul could have backed down. He had enough reasons, enough difficult experiences, real marks that would warrant a pause, a silence, a giving up. But something inside him was sustained by that voice. Fear not. Not as a suggestion, but as an order based on a greater reality. And here's the turning point. Fear has no power to stop progress when there's clarity of mission. He may try to distract, he may try to weaken, he may even make the mind oscillate for a moment. But when the direction is set by God, there is a force that keeps the motion going. This does not mean absence of feeling. Paulo was human. He felt the pressure. He realized the risks. But he did not allow that to define his decisions. There is a difference between feeling fear and being guided by it. And this difference is born when the mind is anchored in God's voice, not in the surrounding circumstances. Maybe you're facing something similar. Not necessarily an external persecution, but an internal pressure that tries to make you stop, retreat, silence something that you know should continue. And the more you think about it, the heavier it looks. But that word reveals something essential. God doesn't need to remove the pressure to sustain you within it. It strengthens the mind in the middle of the process. He speaks just when doubt tries to grow, and that voice, when heard, creates a steadfastness that fear cannot break. There is a kind of fear that is not born of pain, nor of threat, but of the encounter with that which is completely unknown, a moment in which reality seems to surpass everything the mind can explain. This is exactly what happened to Maria. She wasn't in danger, she wasn't being persecuted, she wasn't facing a visible crisis. But suddenly, the supernatural came into play. An angel appears, a message is delivered, and everything that seemed ordinary is no longer common. The immediate reaction is not joy, it is not understanding, it is fear. In Luke 1:30, the first thing the angel says is, "Mary, do not be afraid, for you have found favor with God." This reveals something profound. Fear can also arise when God begins to act unexpectedly, because the supernatural, when it manifests itself, breaks the limits of logic. It challenges control, dismantles certainties, takes the mind to a territory where there are no previous references, and the first human reaction to this is often fear. Not because it's something bad, but because it is something that cannot be explained based on what is already known. Maria receives a message that would completely change her life, something impossible to human eyes, something that would bring consequences, questions, judgments. And in that instant, her mind needed to deal not only with what was being said, but with all that it meant. How many times does God start moving something in your life and, instead of immediate comfort, you feel a certain discomfort, a restlessness, a feeling that something is getting out of control, not because it's going wrong, but because it's going out of the pattern. And it is exactly at this point that fear tries to infiltrate, confusing God's action with uncertainty. But the answer that Mary gives reveals a powerful key. She doesn't understand everything. It doesn't have all the answers, but she chooses to trust. She says, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word." This decision changes everything, because faith does not eliminate the unknown. It allows you to cross it. Mary's mind goes through a transition, from initial scare to acceptance, from fear to surrender. And this is not because everything has become clear, but because she has chosen to align herself with the voice that came from God. This shows that fear in the face of the unknown does not have to be the end. It could be the beginning of something bigger. Maybe there's something in your life that doesn't make sense yet. Something that you can't explain, that seems out of the ordinary, that even generates a certain fear. But what if that's not confusion, but direction? What if, like Mary, you are facing a moment that requires not explanation, but trust? Can you imagine how many people are in need of a word like this right now? Just as you are being reached, others may also be waiting for an answer. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you help this message to reach where it needs to be, becoming an instrument for more lives to be touched by what God is revealing here. There is a fear that goes beyond the present. It's not about what's happening now, but about what can be lost. It is the fear of losing everything, of seeing life fall apart, of no longer having control over anything. And Job knew this fear in a deep way, even before it all happened. At Job 3:25 it is written, "For that which I feared has come upon me." This phrase reveals something unsettling. Suffering often begins within the mind before manifesting itself in reality. Job was a man of integrity, prosperous, respected. But inside him there was a silent fear, maybe not constant, maybe not dominant, but present. And when the losses began, one after another, what was hidden came to light. Family, possessions, health, everything was being ripped out. And it wasn't just the pain of what was happening, it was the weight of seeing an old fear come true. This reveals a delicate point. The human mind has the ability to anticipate negative scenarios with such intensity that even before they happen, they already produce suffering. Fear creates images, builds possibilities, feeds insecurities. And when something really happens, it just seems to confirm something that was already being experienced internally. But Job's story does not end in suffering. There is a process going on, even when all seems lost. God does not immediately answer the questions, does not explain in a direct way the reason for all that, but leads Job to an encounter, and this meeting changes everything. Along the way, Job begins to notice something he didn't see before. His view of God was true, but limited. He knew God from hearing about traditions, from past experiences. But now, in the midst of the pain, something deeper was being revealed. At Job 42:5 he states, "I once knew you just by hearing, but now my eyes see you." This change in perception is the central point, because the greatest fear is not losing things. It is to lose the sense of security. And when everything around you falls apart, the mind is left without reference. But when God reveals himself more deeply, something inside stabilizes, even if circumstances have not yet completely changed. Job did not have his losses reversed immediately, but his mind was transformed before that. The way he saw life, suffering, existence itself, everything has been repositioned. And this weakens fear at its root, because he is no longer supported by assumptions and starts to be confronted by a real revelation. Perhaps the greatest fear that exists is this: losing what seems essential. But Job's story shows that even when everything seems to fall out of place, there is still something that can be strengthened from the inside out. And when this inner base is rebuilt, fear no longer finds the same space to dominate. There is a type of fear that is born not from reality itself, but from the way it is perceived. Two people can look at the same scenario and react in completely different ways. This is exactly what happened when the enemy army surrounded the city where Elisha was. The servant woke up, looked around, and saw only one thing: danger. Soldiers, horses, a real threat, impossible to ignore. And immediately fear took over. His reaction is direct, human, understandable. Despair, urgency, that feeling that there is no way out, because to the natural eye, there really wasn't. But while he saw only the visible, Elisha saw something completely different. He did not deny the existence of the problem, but he also did not limit reality to what his eyes could reach. And then he declares something that to those who are dominated by fear seems impossible to believe. In 2 Kings 6:16, "Do not be afraid, for there are more who are with us than those who are with them." How can anyone say this in the face of such a clear threat scenario? This phrase reveals a level of perception that goes beyond the natural. The servant could not see. To him, those words made no sense, and this shows an important point. Fear grows when the mind is limited to what is visible. When all you consider is what your eyes show, any difficult situation seems bigger than it really is. So Elisha prays. He doesn't ask God to take away the army. He doesn't ask to change the situation immediately. He asks for something different, that the servant's eyes be opened. And at that moment, something extraordinary happens. The same place, the same scenery, but a new vision. Now he sees horses and chariots of fire all around, an invisible protection that had always been there but that he could not perceive. That changes everything. Because the problem was not only the external situation, it was the way she was being interpreted. And when perception changes, fear loses the basis that supported it. The threat still exists, but it no longer seems absolute. There is a greater awareness, a certainty that does not depend on what is seen. How many times have you felt surrounded by situations that seemed hopeless? Moments when everything around indicated difficulty, risk, uncertainty, and the mind automatically went into alert, into worry, into fear. This happens because naturally we are guided by what we see. But this story reveals that there is another way of looking at it, a spiritual vision that does not ignore reality, but amplifies it. God does not need, at all times, to change the scenario immediately. Sometimes he starts by changing the way you see the scenery, and when that change happens, something inside calms down. Not because everything has been resolved from the outside in, but because the mind has come to recognize that there is something greater at work, even if it is not visible to the eye. If this understanding is finding space within you, don't let it go unnoticed. Write in the comments, "God cares for me," and state that truth as a conviction that begins to take shape within your mind. There is a time when fear can no longer be avoided, ignored, or circumvented. A point where it needs to be faced in its most intense, most real, deepest form. Gethsemane is that place. It is not a public setting. There are no crowds. There are no visible miracles. It is a quiet, intimate environment where the battle takes place within the mind and soul. Jesus knew exactly what was coming. There was no doubt. There was no uncertainty about the path. And maybe that's what makes this moment even stronger. Because fear often does not come from doubt. It comes from the certainty of suffering, knowing what will happen, anticipating the pain, feeling the weight even before experiencing all this. It is a type of anguish that reaches deep levels. At Matthew 26:39, Jesus expresses this directly. "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." This is not a distant, cold, or controlled phrase. It is a real expression of emotional tension. This reveals something essential. Even at the highest spiritual level, there is room to feel the weight, the pressure, the impact of what is to come. But what happens right after changes everything. "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Here is the breaking point. It is not the absence of fear that defines victory. It is the decision to align oneself with God's will in spite of it. This reveals a profound principle about how God breaks fear in the mind. He doesn't just act by removing the situation or nullifying the discomfort. It leads the mind to a place of surrender. And surrender is not weakness. It's positioning. It is when the human will, with all its fears, submits to a greater truth. In Gethsemane, the struggle was not against people, nor against external circumstances. It was an internal struggle, a decision that needed to be made in the midst of maximum pressure. And when that decision happens, something is established. The mind aligns, the purpose is strengthened. And fear, even though it is still present, no longer has the power to govern. How many times have you tried to avoid something difficult, asked for it to pass, wished it was different? But deep down, did you know that there was a greater purpose involved? That's the kind of moment that defines everything, not because it's easy, but because it reveals the level of delivery. The real victory is not in escaping the pain, but in not losing alignment in the middle of it. This is when the mind stops fighting the process and starts trusting the one who is driving everything. And when that surrender happens, something changes deep within you. Fear may even try to remain, but it no longer encounters internal resistance based on doubt, finds a firm decision based on trust. What you will hear now can touch exactly the area where you have been fighting the most in silence. There is something being prepared that can bring clarity, direction, and peace in a way that you have not yet experienced. Stay until the end, because this moment can mark a before and after within you. There is a type of fear that is not linked to immediate pain nor to visible danger, but to the loss of control. It's that silent fear of not understanding what God is doing, of not being able to predict the next step, of feeling like something important is being put at risk without a clear explanation. And that was exactly the place where Abraham was taken. After waiting for years, after receiving the promise, after seeing the impossible happen with the birth of Isaac, God makes a request that, at first glance, seems to contradict everything. In Genesis 22:2 it is written, "Take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer it there as a burnt offering." It wasn't just a test of obedience, it was a direct confrontation with the human need to understand, to control, to guarantee the result. Abraham is not given detailed explanations. There is no visible plan. There are no justifications that make immediate sense. And that's exactly where fear could have taken over. Because when the mind doesn't understand, it tries to fill in the blanks with assumptions. What if all this is lost? What if the promise ends here? What if nothing makes sense in the end? This kind of thinking is born when control slips out of your hands. But what Abraham does reveals a different level of confidence. He doesn't ignore the pain. He doesn't pretend he doesn't feel, but he decides to move forward, even without fully understanding. This shows that true faith is not based on complete explanations, but on trust in the one who is leading. Every step on that journey was an internal confrontation. Climbing the hill was not just a physical movement, it was a walk against his own thoughts. Logic said one thing, the promise seemed to conflict with the command, but Abraham chooses not to rely only on what he can understand. And it is at this point that something profound happens inside the mind. When you relinquish control, you create space to trust in a way that wasn't possible before. As long as everything is under control, trust is limited. But when you don't have all the answers, trust becomes essential. Abraham reaches the most critical moment, when everything seems to be about to come to fruition in the most difficult way possible. And then, at the last moment, God intervenes. This reveals something essential. God never intended to destroy the promise. He was working on the internal structure of the person who carried it, because the greatest fear was not to lose Isaac, it was to lose control of one's own history. And when this control is delivered, something greater is established. The mind stops trying to predict every detail and begins to rest in the certainty that God sees beyond. This transformation changes everything, because fear loses strength when there is no longer a need to understand everything in order to trust. When the mind accepts that not everything needs to make immediate sense, but can still be part of a greater purpose, a new peace begins to emerge. And it is exactly in this place that God breaks one of the deepest fears that exist, the fear of not having control. Because in the end, it's not about holding everything with your own hands, but to trust those who have never lost control of anything. There is a type of fear that does not appear on the face, does not manifest itself in words that are easy to identify, but accumulates silently within the soul. It's that constant weight, that anxiety that grows little by little, that anguish that no one sees but that consumes inside. Anna lived exactly like that. She was not at war. She was not surrounded by enemies. But inside her there was a deep conflict, a pain that repeated itself day after day. Barrenness at that time was not just a physical condition. It was also an emotional and social brand. Comparisons, teasing, feelings of inadequacy. All this fed an internal restlessness that did not cease. And the most difficult thing is that this type of pain does not find an easy way out. It is not solved with external words, it is not relieved with distractions. It remains there, swirling inside the mind, creating thoughts that repeat and intensify. But there comes a time when something changes. Anna no longer tries to hide, no longer tries to endure alone, no longer tries to organize everything within her own mind. It goes to God, and it doesn't go with rehearsed words, it doesn't go with organized speeches. She goes with what she has, with real pain, with the soul exposed, with the heart completely open. In 1 Samuel 1:15 she says, "I am a woman afflicted in spirit. I have poured out my soul before the Lord." This phrase reveals something profound. There is a point at which fear and anxiety begin to lose strength, when they cease to be trapped within the mind and are surrendered before God. Because while everything is stored, thoughts are repeated, amplified, distorted. But when they are exposed, when they are put out, something begins to reorganize. Not necessarily because the situation changes immediately, but because the mind is no longer carrying everything on its own. Hannah's cry was not just a request. It was an emptying, a moment when everything that was accumulated began to be released. And this changes the internal structure. Anxiety loses space when it no longer finds silence to grow. Fear weakens when it is confronted by the presence of God, and something impressive happens after that. The external situation had not yet changed, but Anna was no longer the same. The Bible shows that she got up, fed, and her countenance was no longer sad. This reveals a powerful secret. Peace did not begin with the response, started with delivery. How many times have you tried to solve everything just by thinking, analyzing, trying to understand? And the more he thought, the heavier he became. Perhaps what is missing is not more mental effort, but spiritual surrender. Because there is a kind of relief that does not come from immediate answers, but from a heart that decides not to carry everything alone. When the soul opens, the mind begins to find rest. If this is touching something inside you, maybe it's time to not keep it anymore. Write your prayer request in the comments. Put there, in simple words, what is in your heart. When you do that, you're not just writing. He's taking a real step of faith, joining a chain where every cry is presented before God with confidence. There is a type of fear that is not born within, but is fed from without. Words, criticism, threats, looks, everything around begins to press on the mind, trying to weaken what is being built. Nehemiah lived exactly this scenario. He was given a clear mission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But along with the purpose, there were also contrary voices. While he worked, accusations emerged. As he advanced, attempts to distract appeared. As long as he stood firm, the surrounding environment tried to generate doubt. And that's how external fear works. It doesn't have to go in directly. It creates an environment where everything seems difficult, risky, unstable. How many times have you started something important and suddenly negative opinions, unexpected criticisms or situations that seemed to want to stop you appeared? It wasn't necessarily an internal fear at first, but little by little it began to influence his thoughts. This happens because the mind absorbs the environment when it is not firmly aligned with the purpose. Nehemiah could have backed down. He could have heeded the criticism, stopped to respond to each accusation, been distracted by each attempt to interrupt. But he does something different. He stays focused. He does not negotiate with external pressure. And when he feels the weight, he doesn't respond to men. He answers to God. At Nehemiah 6:9, he declares, "Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands." This prayer is simple, direct, but profoundly strategic. He doesn't ask for enemies to disappear. He doesn't ask for the environment to change. He asks for strength to continue. This reveals a powerful secret about how fear is broken. God doesn't always remove the pressure around you, but he strengthens the mind from within. And when the mind is strengthened, the environment loses the power to influence. The rebuilding that Nehemiah led was not only physical, it was also emotional and spiritual. Each stone placed represented an advance not only in the wall, but in the inner firmness of those who refused to stop. And this completely changes the dynamics of fear, because it stops being a block and becomes just a noise around. The most interesting thing is that, even under pressure, the work continued. This shows that fear does not have absolute power. He can try to delay, distract, weaken, but it cannot stop someone who is aligned with a higher purpose. Maybe today you are trying to rebuild something in your life. It can be your peace, your faith, your hope, your confidence. And at the same time, there are voices around trying to make you stop. Thoughts arise, doubts appear, pressures increase. But Nehemiah's story reveals that it is not the environment that defines advancement, is the focus. When the mind stays aligned with what God has placed, there is a force that sustains, even when everything around it seems otherwise. And this strength does not come from human effort only. It comes from a spiritual alignment that holds the direction steady. Even under pressure, even with opposition, even with everything trying to distract, the mind keeps moving forward because it knows exactly why it started. There is a time in life when fear is not only linked to what can happen to you, but to the impact your decision can have on other people, a moment when being silent feels safer. But at the same time, being silent can be too costly. Esther was placed exactly at this point. She was in a privileged position inside the palace, protected, away from the threat that hung over her people. Humanly, it made sense to remain there, in silence, preserving one's own life. But the reality around it demanded something different. There was a decree of destruction, a plan already in progress. And suddenly, Esther realizes that her position was not just a privilege, it was a responsibility. The fear was real. Approaching the king without being called was not only risky, it was potentially fatal. There was no guarantee of acceptance. There was no security in the result. It was a decision where the risk was evident. And it is exactly at this point that the mind comes into conflict. On the one hand, the instinct of self-preservation. On the other, the weight of purpose. How many times have you found yourself in situations where speaking, acting, or taking a stand seemed necessary, but at the same time, scary? Moments when silence seemed more comfortable, safer, less risky. But something inside you said that standing still wasn't the answer. Esther goes through this internal process. She doesn't ignore fear. She doesn't act impulsively. She prepares herself. He fasts, seeks direction, strengthens himself spiritually. This reveals an important principle. Spiritual courage is born not from the absence of fear, but from a mind aligned with something greater than itself. And then comes the decision. At Esther 4:16 she declares, "And if I perish, I perish." This sentence is not a sign of giving up. It is a position. It is the moment when purpose becomes greater than fear, when the mind is no longer governed by risk and is guided by mission. This change is profound, because fear loses strength when it no longer finds room to negotiate, when the decision is made, when the heart is aligned, when the mind accepts the cost. Fear can no longer paralyze in the same way. Esther didn't know exactly how it would all end. She had no control over the king's reaction, no guarantee of protection. But she understood something essential. Not taking a stand was also a decision. And perhaps even more dangerous, God raises people up at specific times, in scenarios where positioning makes a difference not only for them, but for many around them. And these people are not the ones who don't feel afraid. They are those who do not allow him to determine his actions. Maybe there's something in your life right now that demands a position, something you've been avoiding, postponing, ignoring, not because of lack of understanding, but because of fear. But what if that moment is exactly the point where everything can start to change? You have been reached by this message for a reason. There is something being awakened within you. If this made sense in a profound way, write in the comments, "God chose me." Sometimes acknowledging this is the first step to experiencing something greater than fear. There is a type of fear that is not only born from within, but is reinforced by external voices. It is not the limitation itself that holds the most. It is the environment that tries to silence any attempt at change. Bartimaeus lived like this. He faced not only physical blindness, but also a reality where his voice had no value, where his presence was ignored, where any attempt to express himself was quickly drowned out. But at a certain moment, something changes. He hears that Jesus is passing by, and that simple detail ignites something inside him. It's not a complete certainty, it's not a logical explanation, it's an opportunity. And often it all starts like this: a moment, a chance, a sign that something can be different. Then he begins to cry out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." It's not a timid request, it's not a discreet attempt, it is a cry. And immediately, external pressure appears. In Mark 10:48 it is written, "And many rebuked him, that he should hold his peace, but he cried out more and more." This reveals something profound. Whenever someone decides to break with the silence imposed by fear, There will be voices trying to restore that silence. The crowd didn't understand what was going on inside him. To them, it was just someone making noise, someone out of place. But for Bartimaeus, it was the moment that could change everything. And it is exactly at this point that the internal decision becomes stronger than the external pressure. How many times have you felt like acting, to speak, to take a step of faith? But did something around you try to make you retreat? It may not have been a literal crowd, but opinions, judgments, thoughts that arise as if they were voices telling you to shut up, not to try, not to expose yourself. The fear in this case does not come only from the situation, it comes from the possibility of being seen, of being questioned, of not being accepted. And this causes many people to remain silent, even when there is an opportunity before them. But Bartimaeus does the opposite. The more they try to silence him, the more he cries out. This reveals a decisive point. Liberation begins when the mind decides to no longer obey the voice it tries to silence. When the need for a response becomes greater than the fear of exposing oneself. And then something happens. Jesus stops. In the midst of the crowd, in the midst of the movement, in the midst of so many voices, he hears that particular cry. This shows that God does not ignore those who decide to break the silence. There is an answer for those who insist, for those who do not back down, for those who do not accept to remain in the same place. And when Bartimaeus finally approaches, Jesus asks him what he wants. It seems obvious. But this question reveals something important. Faith needs to be expressed. The mind needs to assume what it wants, without fear, without retreat. Perhaps there is something inside you that has been silenced for a long time. A cry you avoided expressing, a decision you postponed, a faith you kept. But what if this is the time to break this silence? Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and everything that has been said so far is preparing you for something deeper. Stay until the end, because there is a moment that can touch exactly this area of your life that you have never been able to explain, but have always felt. There is a type of fear that does not come from what is about to happen, but from what has already happened. A fear that feeds on guilt, memories, mistakes that seem impossible to erase. The woman brought to Jesus carried just that. She wasn't just in front of people ready to accuse. It was already doomed within the mind itself. The scene is intense. It is exposed, placed in the center, surrounded by looks, judgments, and stones ready to be thrown. But even before any external action, there is something happening inside it. Guilt had already built a prison. Shame had already defined an identity. And when that happens, fear is no longer just a reaction. It becomes constant. How often does this also happen silently? There is no crowd around, there are no visible accusations, but inside the mind, the voices continue. Memories that come back, thoughts that accuse, a feeling that there is no more chance, that error defines the future. But then Jesus enters the scene. And instead of reacting as everyone expected, he does something completely different. He does not ignore the situation, but he does not feed the condemnation either. One by one, the accusers leave. And suddenly, that woman who was surrounded by voices finds herself in silence, only with him. This moment reveals something profound, because the biggest problem wasn't just the stones, it was the condemnation that was already within her. And then Jesus says in John 8:11, "Neither do I condemn you. Go away and sin no more." This phrase carries a power that goes beyond forgiveness. It breaks a mental structure. Neither do I condemn you. This directly confronts the guilt that imprisons. This dismantles the idea that error defines who she is. This makes room for something new, because while the mind is stuck in condemnation, the future does not exist. But when that condemnation is removed, something begins to rebuild. And soon after comes a direction. "Go away and sin no more." This shows that grace doesn't just liberate, she repositions. It is not a permission to remain the same, but an opportunity to live differently, without the weight that previously paralyzed. Guilt-based fear loses strength when identity is restored, when the person stops seeing himself as the mistake he made and begins to see the possibility of a new path. And that completely changes the way the mind reacts. Maybe there's something in your past that still tries to hold you back. Something that, even though it has already passed, continues to influence your thoughts, your decisions, your way of seeing yourself. But this story shows that the last word is not the prosecution's, it is of grace. And when that truth starts to enter the mind, something changes. Fear is no longer fueled by guilt, and the mind begins to find space to live without this constant weight. If this message has reached you, perhaps there is a greater reason behind it. And if you want to continue receiving words that strengthen your mind and renew your faith, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what God is starting here can continue to transform far beyond this moment. There is a kind of fear that does not manifest itself as apparent weakness, but as silent resistance. It's not the fear of failure. It is the fear of fulfilling exactly what God has asked. Jonas reveals this dimension clearly. He wasn't lost. He wasn't without direction. On the contrary, he knew exactly what he needed to do. And even so, he decided to go in the opposite direction. In Jonah 1:3 it is written, "Jonah arose to flee from the presence of the Lord." This was not an impulsive mistake, it was a conscious choice, and it reveals something profound about the human mind. Sometimes the greatest conflict is not figuring out the purpose, is to accept it, because fulfilling the purpose is not always comfortable. It doesn't always make immediate sense. It does not always fit into what the person would like to experience. And it is at this point that fear manifests itself in a more subtle way. He doesn't say you can't do it. He says, maybe it's not that. Maybe there's another way. Maybe it's better to avoid it. How many times has this happened inside you? A clear direction. Something you know you should do, but at the same time, an internal resistance that tries to justify the deviation. It doesn't seem like disobedience. It just seems like a different choice. But deep down, there is a discomfort that cannot be easily explained. Jonas runs away, gets on a ship, tries to follow another route. But something begins to happen. A storm rises. And this is not just an external event. It is a reflection of an internal misalignment. When the mind tries to escape from what God has ordained, peace begins to be replaced by restlessness. And even trying to ignore it, even trying to move on, Jonas can't completely escape. Because purpose is not something that is easily abandoned. It remains, even when it is avoided, and God, in His sovereignty, begins to lead the way again. The storm, the throw into the sea, the big fish. All of this may seem extreme, but it reveals something essential. God does not give up on aligning what He has started. Even when the mind resists, even when it tries to run away, there is a divine movement bringing it back to the point of origin. Inside the fish, in silence without distractions, Jonas finally confronts himself. There is nowhere else to run, there are no more external justifications. It is an internal meeting, and it is in this place that something begins to break. Resistance loses strength when reality can no longer be avoided. The fear of fulfilling the purpose begins to be replaced by a greater understanding. Not necessarily about all the details, but about the importance of obeying. Because in the end, running away does not eliminate the call. It only postpones the process. And when Jonas decides to line up, everything changes. The path makes sense again. The direction is resumed, and what seemed impossible to face begins to be lived with another perspective. This reveals that God doesn't just confront fear. It works at the root of resistance. It leads the mind to the point where it is no longer possible to deny what has been established. And at that moment, the decision is no longer about avoiding, and it becomes about trusting, even without all the answers. There is a kind of prison that does not need visible chains because it is installed within the mind, a condition that begins as pain, as a limitation, but over time transforms into something even deeper: conformism. The paralytic of Bethesda lived like this. It wasn't just the body that was paralyzed, it was expectation, hope, the ability to believe that something could change. Years passing, the same routine, the same place, the same repeated frustration. In the beginning, maybe there was trying, effort, hope, but over time, the mind begins to adapt to the pain. And this is one of the quietest effects of fear. It doesn't just scare, he gets used to it. When Jesus approaches, he does not begin with an immediate miracle. He asks a question. In John 5:6, will you be made whole? At first glance, it seems obvious. Who doesn't want to be healed? But this question reveals something much deeper. Because after so long, the desire may have been weakened, distorted, or even buried. The man's answer is not a direct yes. He begins to explain, to justify, to point out reasons why he never succeeded. I don't have anyone to put me in the tank. When I try, another comes down before me. This shows that his mind was already conditioned to think within limitations. He does not answer in faith, responds with history. How often does this also happen? When an opportunity for change arises, the first reaction is not to believe, it is to remember everything that has gone wrong. The mind, accustomed to stagnation, creates arguments to stay in the same place. And fear, which once paralyzed, now keeps everything as it is. But Jesus does not enter into this cycle of explanations. He doesn't debate the reasons. He doesn't validate the limitations. He gives a command: get up, take up your mat and walk. This completely breaks the logic of that moment, because change does not begin when all conditions are favorable. It begins when the mind decides to respond to the word that has been released. And there something powerful happens. That man, who for years remained in the same state, stands up. Not because the environment has changed, not because someone has finally helped, but because there was an internal rupture. The mind left the place of conformism and responded to a new reality. This reveals an essential point. Fear can evolve into something even more dangerous, which is the acceptance of a condition as permanent. When this happens, the person no longer fights, no longer waits, no longer tries anymore. But when God comes in, he doesn't just offer change. It awakens the desire that was dormant. Maybe there's some area of your life that has been stuck for too long, something that you have already tried to change, but that over time you stopped believing that it could be different, and without realizing it, the mind adjusted to it. But that question keeps echoing. Do you want to be transformed? Because it all starts from that internal response. And when that decision happens, even if it's small, something starts to move. Few people will understand the depth of this, but if you're here right now, there's a reason. Continue to the end, because there is something being revealed that can touch exactly this area of your life that has been stuck for so long. There's a type of fear that is not linked to what you face, but to what you think about yourself. It is the fear of not being enough, of not being up to it, of being seen as someone inadequate for what they need to do. Timothy carried this weight. He had a calling, an important spiritual responsibility. But at the same time, he dealt with internal insecurities that tried to weaken his position. Being young in that context was not just a characteristic, it was a reason to be questioned, ignored, even despised. And this has a direct impact on the mind, Because when the environment begins to reinforce doubts about who you are, these thoughts can begin to repeat internally. Can I do it? Am I capable? Am I ready? Paul, realizing this, not only guides, he directly confronts this mentality. At 1 Timothy 4:12 he says, "Let no one despise your youth." This phrase is not just external advice, it is an internal command. It's as if you're saying, don't accept this limited view of yourself, don't allow it to define your identity. This reveals something essential. The fear of rejection and inadequacy arises when the mind is based more on external opinion than on what God has already declared. When the reference is in people, in circumstances, in comparisons, there will always be reason to doubt. But when the reference changes, the internal structure begins to strengthen. Paul continues, guiding Timothy to be an example, not by age, but by conduct, by faith, by the way of living. This completely changes the perspective. Because spiritual identity is not built by what others say, is revealed by the way you position yourself. How many times have you felt this way? As if there was not enough, as if something was missing, as if others were more prepared, more capable, more adequate. This kind of thinking doesn't come out of nowhere. It is fueled by comparisons, past experiences, words that have been heard over time. But the truth is, when God calls, He doesn't rely on those criteria. He doesn't choose someone because he seems ready to humanize. He strengthens the one who has been called. And this strength starts from within, in the way the person starts to see themselves. Timothy had to go through this process. It wasn't instantaneous, it wasn't automatic, but it was built. Each orientation, each word, each step taken in obedience was strengthening his mind, adjusting his perception, consolidating his identity. And when this identity begins to take hold, the fear of rejection loses ground, because validation no longer comes from outside. It comes from within, based on what God has established. The mind stabilizes, not because everyone around agrees, but because there is an inner certainty that no longer depends on it. Perhaps this is the point that needs to be adjusted today. Not what's around you, but the way you see yourself within it all. Because when identity is strengthened, the fear of inadequacy ceases to be an obstacle and becomes just a reminder of who you are no longer. There is a type of fear that gains strength when the pressure is not individual, but collective. When the whole environment seems threatening, when the opposition does not come from an isolated thought, but from an external reality that tries to silence, intimidate, stop. The early church lived just that. It wasn't just a discomfort. It was real persecution, real risk, clear consequences for those who decided to continue. They were warned, pressured, threatened directly so that they would no longer talk about what they were experiencing. Humanly, the retreat would make sense. Silence would seem the safest choice. But what happens next reveals something that completely changes the dynamics of fear. They do not isolate themselves. They don't try to face everything alone. They meet. And that makes all the difference. Because fear grows in isolation, but loses strength when it finds unity, when each one brings their experience, their faith, their conviction. Something collective begins to form, and the mind no longer carries the weight alone. And then they pray. But they do not ask for the persecution to end. They do not ask for protection in the most ordinary sense. In Acts 4:29 they say, "Grant to your servants to speak your word with all boldness." This reveals a different level of understanding. They are not focused on removing the threat, are focused on not losing positioning. That changes everything, because fear is no longer the center of the decision. The priority is no longer to avoid risk, it is to remain true to the purpose. And when this change happens, something supernatural begins to manifest. Boldness does not come from the absence of danger. It comes from a greater presence that sustains, even in front of it. How many times has fear tried to silence you? Not necessarily with visible persecutions, but with situations that make you retreat, avoid, hide what you believe, what you feel, what you know you should express. And little by little, the silence seems more comfortable. But this story shows that there is another way. A path where strength does not come only from within, but from connecting with others who share the same faith. Where the mind is strengthened not only by individual decision, but by the unity it sustains. And when this unity is formed, something happens in the environment. The Bible shows that the place where they were shook, this wasn't just physical. It was a sign that something spiritual was being released. A confirmation that, even in the face of pressure, there was power available to continue. Fear loses strength when it finds an aligned mind, but it loses even more when it finds an aligned community. Because what seemed too big for one becomes smaller when divided among many who stand firm. Maybe you're not alone as you think. Perhaps there is a strength that has not yet been accessed because you have tried to face everything in isolation. But when faith connects, when truth is shared, when positioning is maintained, something begins to change. If this message is finding space within you, don't let it pass quietly. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action," and state that truth as a conscious decision to stand firm regardless of your surroundings. There is a type of fear that does not come from external threats, nor from visible situations, but of internal confusion. When the mind cannot distinguish what is God's direction and what is just self-thought, everything becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is a breeding ground for fear. Samuel lived this moment very clearly. Still young, in an environment of silence, he hears a voice, but he doesn't recognize it. He gets up, goes to Eli, believing that he has been called by him. This is repeated more than once. The voice was there, clear, real. But the mind still did not know how to identify its origin. And this reveals something profound. Listening is not the same as discerning. How often does this happen inside you? Thoughts arise, ideas appear, feelings manifest. But there is a constant doubt. Does this come from God, or is it just something in my mind? And this lack of clarity generates insecurity, because when you don't know which direction to go, any step seems risky. Fear grows in this space of confusion. It feeds on doubt, lack of certainty, the difficulty of recognizing what is true. And often, it is not the absence of response that causes the problem. It is the inability to recognize the answer when it comes. Samuel needed guidance. Eli realizes what is happening and instructs him. This shows that discernment is also learned. It's not automatic, it's not born ready, is developed. The mind needs to be trained to recognize God's voice. And then, when the voice calls again, Samuel responds differently. In 1 Samuel 3:10 he says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." This response reveals an alignment that did not exist before. Now there is no more confusion, no more doubt about who is speaking. That is the point where something changes profoundly. Because when God's voice becomes familiar, the mind finds direction. And when there is direction, fear loses space. He no longer finds a lost, indecisive mind, vulnerable to doubt. It finds a mind that knows how to recognize the origin of what it hears. This does not mean that all answers will come easily or immediately, but it does mean that there is a foundation being built, a sensitivity that develops, an ability to distinguish what brings peace, clarity, and direction, of that which only generates confusion and unrest. Perhaps what has fueled the fear is not only the situation itself, but the difficulty of understanding what to do in the face of it. The feeling of hearing many voices at the same time, not knowing which one to follow. But this story shows that God doesn't just speak, He also teaches how to listen. It leads the mind to a place where confusion begins to give way to clarity. And when that happens, something inside stabilizes, because fear depends on uncertainty. But when the direction becomes clear, even if the path is not yet completely visible, the mind finds a resting point. And it is in this place that the process of transformation continues, further deepening this connection between listening, discerning, and walking safely. There is a type of fear that is born from the feeling of helplessness. When something gets out of control, when there is nothing more to do, when all attempts seem insufficient, the mind enters a state of constant anxiety. It is the fear of losing, of not being able to prevent it, of not having enough authority to change the situation. The Roman centurion was faced with this. He had position, he had power, he had authority in the natural world. He was used to giving orders and being obeyed. But in the face of his servant's illness, all this structure was not enough. And it is exactly at this point that many get lost. Because when what has always worked stops solving, the mind is left without reference. But the centurion saw something that many did not realize. He understood that there was a greater authority, an authority that did not depend on physical presence, human effort, or favorable circumstances. At Matthew 8:8, he states, "Speak only one word, and my servant will certainly be healed." This phrase reveals a deep understanding. He does not ask Jesus to come to his house. It does not require visible signs. It does not try to control how the miracle will happen. He recognizes that a single word is enough. This completely changes the dynamics of the mind, because anxiety feeds on the need to see, to control, to understand every detail. But when there is confidence in God's authority, that need begins to disappear. The centurion makes a simple but powerful connection. He compares spiritual authority with the authority he already knew. I, too, am a man subject to authority, and I have soldiers at my command. He understands that just as his words were obeyed in the natural world, Jesus' words carried authority in the spirit world. This brings stability, because the mind stops depending on what it sees and begins to settle on what has been declared. And when that happens, the fear of loss begins to weaken. The feeling of powerlessness loses space, because it's no longer about what you can do, but of what God has already released. How many times does anxiety arise precisely because you feel like you need to solve everything, control everything, ensure everything? And the more you try, the more you realize that there are things that are beyond your capacity. This generates tension, worry, wear. But this story reveals that there is another way, a path where the mind finds rest, not because everything is visibly resolved, but because there is a word that sustains, and this word does not depend on circumstances to be fulfilled. Jesus marvels at that man's faith, not because of the position he had, but because of the way he saw it. Because recognizing God's authority above all else is what repositions the mind. It is what brings order to the internal chaos. It is what silences anxiety. And when this understanding is established, something changes profoundly. The mind stops oscillating between possibilities and begins to settle on a certainty, not based on what can happen, but in what has already been determined by an authority that does not fail. This is the key that breaks the fear of powerlessness. It's not about increasing control. It is recognizing who is really in control. There is a type of fear that sets in when resources run out. It's not just the lack, it is the constant awareness that there is nowhere else to draw. The widow of Zarephath was living exactly this limit. Hunger was no longer a distant threat, it was a present reality, and all she had was enough for one last meal. After that, only the unknown. That's the point where the mind collapses, because when everything points to the end, thoughts begin to close. There is no more expectation. There is no more planning. There is no longer a vision of continuity. Just momentary survival. And it is in this scenario that God decides to act. The prophet Elijah comes to her with an unexpected request. He does not bring immediate provision. He does not start by solving the problem. He asks first. This directly confronts human logic. How can someone who no longer has almost anything still deliver something? It is at this moment that the fear of scarcity reveals itself most strongly, because the mind begins to calculate. If I give it, it will be lacking. If I deliver, I won't have enough. This type of thinking is natural, but it is also limiting. It is based only on what is visible, on what can be counted, measured, controlled. But then comes a word. In 1 Kings 17:14, the flour in the pot will not run out, and the oil in the cruse will not fail. This promise completely breaks the logic of scarcity. Because she doesn't rely on what the widow has, it is based on what God sustains. And here's the turning point. The mind needs to decide in which logic it will operate. In the logic of lack, which is based on what is limited, or on the logic of faith, which is based on that which cannot be seen but has been declared. The widow decides to trust, even with little, even with fear, even without visible guarantees. It acts, and this movement changes everything. Because provision does not begin before the decision. It starts after it. Day after day, the flour does not run out. The oil continues. There is no excess, there is no accumulation, but there is no shortage either. This reveals a new way of living, a constant dependency, where the mind learns to trust the flow and not just the stock. How many times has the fear of scarcity dominated your thoughts? Not only in relation to material resources, but also to opportunities, time, energy. That feeling that it is not enough, that it can end at any moment. But this story shows that God doesn't just supply for the world's most important things. He teaches. He breaks the mentality of lack by introducing a reality where provision depends not only on what is in His hands, but on what is in His word. And when the mind begins to understand this, something changes profoundly. Anxiety decreases, excessive attachment weakens, and trust begins to grow, because it's no longer about how much you have, but of those who are supporting it. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can touch exactly the area where you feel you are on edge. Stay tuned, because what comes now can be a direct sign from God for your life. There is a level of fear that goes beyond anxiety, doubt, or insecurity. That's when the mind is no longer just influenced, is dominated. The Gadarene man lived in this extreme. He dwelt not among people, but among tombs. He had no control over himself. He had no peace. He had no identity. It was a living portrait of a completely imprisoned mind, where chaos was not a moment. It was constant. People around him had already tried to restrain him. Chains, shackles, but nothing worked. Because the problem was not physical, it was internal. And this reveals something profound. When the mind is imprisoned, external solutions are not enough. There may even be attempts at control, but there is no real transformation. This man was no longer alive. He survived in a state of total disorder, without direction, without full awareness, without self-control. And this is the most critical point of fear, when it ceases to be a reaction and starts to rule completely. But then Jesus arrives, and everything begins to change from that meeting. There is no negotiation with chaos. There is no adaptation to the state in which it finds itself. There is authority. There is direct confrontation with that which was dominating that mind. What happens there is not just an improvement. It is a total liberation. Because God doesn't work on superficial adjustments when it comes to the mind. He goes to the root, removes that which imprisons, restores that which has been lost. In Luke 8:35 it is written, "And they found the man, clothed and in a sound mind." This image is powerful. The same man who was once out of control is now at peace. The same one who lived among tombs is now in order. The same one who had no dominion is now in his right mind. This reveals that no mind is too lost. It doesn't matter the level of confusion, pain, oppression. There is a transformation possible when there is a real encounter with God. And this transformation is not partial, it is complete. Identity is restored. Consciousness returns to its place. Peace, which once seemed impossible, is established. And this completely changes the way of seeing one's own state, because what seemed definitive was really just a state that could be transformed. How many times does a person start to believe that there is no way out, that has tried everything, that has already reached the limit, that there is no way to return to balance? This type of thinking is the reflection of a mind that can no longer see beyond its own condition. But this story breaks that idea. It shows that there is no endpoint when God decides to intervene. It shows that even the most extreme scenario can be completely reversed. And more than that, it shows that the mind can be restored to a level of clarity, peace, and balance that once seemed impossible. This kind of liberation does not come from human effort. It does not come from repeated attempts. It comes from an encounter. A moment where what dominated loses authority, and what was lost is restored. And when this happens, fear no longer has space, because the mind is no longer under domination, is free. Free to think, to feel, to live in a completely different way. And this freedom is not temporary. It is a new reality being established. There is a type of fear that does not manifest itself as panic or overt anxiety, but as resistance to change. It's that quiet discomfort that keeps everything as it is, even when the person himself knows he needs something different. Zacchaeus lived in this place. He had position, he had resources, but he carried rejection, internal conflicts, and an evident distance from what could really transform his life. He was already used to the look of people, to the judgments, to the way he was seen. And over time, this will shape the mind. The person begins to adapt to the label, to accept an identity built by external experiences and opinions. And this creates an invisible barrier where change seems distant, uncomfortable, even impossible. But something happens that day. Zacchaeus hears that Jesus is passing by. And even without understanding everything, something inside him moves. It's not a complete certainty, it is a decision. He decides to see it, and this decision, as simple as it may seem, breaks an internal structure. Because for that, he needs to get out of the commonplace. You need to ignore what people will think. You need to overcome limitations. You need to act in a way that was not standard. Climbing a tree wasn't just a physical movement. It was a break with the way he had always positioned himself. How many times does the fear of change prevent exactly this first step? It's not that the person doesn't want something different. The way to this requires getting out of the pattern, facing discomfort, breaking old habits. And the mind, accustomed to control, tries to avoid this process. But Zacchaeus decides to go beyond that. And it is at this moment that something surprising happens. In Luke 19:5, Jesus says, "Zacchaeus, come down quickly, for today it is fitting for me to stay at your house." He doesn't just see Jesus, he is seen. He not only seeks, he is called. This reveals a powerful principle. When there is a real decision to approach, God responds, not in a distant way, but in a personal, direct, specific way. And this meeting changes everything. The presence of Jesus inside Zacchaeus' house represents more than a visit. It represents an internal transformation. Because when the mind decides to open up, when it breaks through resistance, when it allows this approach, something begins to be reorganized inside. The fear of change loses strength when the decision has already been made. Because from that point on, it's no longer about staying in the same place. It is a matter of responding to what has been started. And Zacchaeus' transformation was not superficial. It was visible, practical, real. This shows that when the mind changes, attitudes follow. When the decision is true, the fruits appear. Maybe there's something inside you that you've realized you need to change, but you haven't taken the first step yet. Not for lack of will, but because of the discomfort it generates. But this story reveals that it all starts with a decision to get out of the commonplace, to search, even without understanding everything, to take a stand, even if it looks different. Because it is in this movement that the encounter happens, and it is in this encounter that the mind begins to be transformed in a profound way. There is a fear that almost no one likes to face, the fear of the end. Not only the end of a situation, but the definitive end, that thought that at some point crosses your mind. What if it's too late? What if there is no more chance? This type of fear is deep, silent, and often avoided. But it is exactly in this place that one of the most powerful scenes takes place. A man, condemned, with no past to be proud of, no future to plan, stands beside Jesus on the cross. Everything around indicates an end. There is no more time to rebuild. There is no more opportunity to change history. There is no more room to correct choices. Humanly, everything is over, but something happens inside him. Even in that state, even in that final moment, he recognizes something different in Jesus. While others scoff, while the atmosphere is one of pain and contempt, he makes a simple but profound request. In Luke 23:42, he says, "Remember me." This phrase carries more than words, carries an internal decision. Because at that moment he could completely surrender to despair, guilt, fear of judgment. But he chooses to look beyond what was visible. He chooses to believe, even without having more time. And Jesus' answer completely breaks any human logic. Today you will be with me in paradise. There is no waiting, there is no future condition, there are no additional requirements. There is an immediate answer. This reveals something that completely transforms the way we see the fear of the end, because what seemed to be the last moment becomes the first of something eternal. What seemed to be the end point turns into a new beginning, and this shows that for God it is never too late to restore. The fear of judgment, of condemnation, of lack of time, all of this loses strength in the face of this truth. Because the mind comes to understand that it is not the past that defines destiny. It is the decision made in the presence of God. How many times has the mind been dominated by thoughts such as, "Time has passed, there is no other way, there is no more opportunity"? This type of thinking creates a silent prison where the person believes that there is no way out. But this scene reveals the opposite. It shows that even at the last moment there is access, that even at the most unlikely point there is an answer, that even when everything seems to be over, God can still write something new. And that changes everything, because the fear of the end ceases to be a point of despair and is confronted by a hope that does not depend on time nor on circumstances, but on grace. Maybe there's something inside you that seems to have reached its limit, something that you believe can no longer be restored. But this story shows that the moment does not define God's reach. At the end of this video, there's something prepared that can touch exactly that deeper area. Stay until the end, because you can feel God's presence in a way that you may never have experienced before. There is a type of fear that arises when the mind tries to look ahead and cannot see clearly. The unknown has this power. It creates scenarios, raises doubts, generates insecurity. John was in that very place, isolated on Patmos, cut off from it all, in an environment that naturally favored thoughts of uncertainty. He could easily be consumed by this kind of fear. Because when there is no control over the future, the mind tries to fill in the blanks with assumptions. What's going to happen now? How does it all end? Is there anything beyond this moment? These questions, when they do not find answers, can generate deep unease. And it is in this scenario that God decides to reveal something completely different. Juan does not only receive consolation, he receives vision. He begins to see that which is beyond the present time. Revelations that go beyond the now, that show the future, that expose a reality that cannot be perceived by the natural senses. And in view of this, the initial reaction is strong. In Revelation 1:17, he falls as dead. This shows that the supernatural, when it manifests itself in its fullness, completely confronts the human structure. But the first word that comes next changes everything. Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. This statement is not just a consolation. It is a revelation of identity. God does not begin by explaining the future. He does not detail all the events. It reveals who is in control of everything. This transforms the way the mind deals with the unknown. Because fear is not born only from the lack of information, it is born from the feeling that no one is in control. But when this truth is established, something changes profoundly. The future may not be fully understood, but it is no longer a threat. God presents himself as the beginning and the end, like the one who was already before everything and who remains after everything. This takes the weight off the mind of trying to understand every detail, because it is no longer necessary to control time. Just trust in those who govern time. How many times has the fear of the unknown tried to paralyze you? Situations that have not yet happened, decisions that have not yet been made, paths that are not yet clear, and even so the mind already begins to restless, trying to anticipate answers. But this revelation shows that security is not in knowing everything, it is in knowing who is in charge of everything. When this awareness is established, fear begins to lose space, because the unknown is no longer empty territory. It is a place where God is already present, and that brings a different peace, not based on predictions, but on confidence, not sustained by control, but by revelation. The mind begins to rest, even without having all the answers, because it recognizes that there is a higher authority leading every detail. Maybe you're looking ahead right now and can't clearly see what's ahead, but this word did not come by chance. Nothing happens without a purpose. If this is making sense to you, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord," and declare that trust as a conscious decision to deliver the future into the hands of those who already know the end from the beginning. All that has been revealed so far points to a truth that can no longer be ignored. When the mind recognizes who God is, fear loses its place where it was sustained. Each experience has shown that it is not the absence of problems that brings peace, but the real presence of God within what seemed impossible to face. And now, this understanding needs to leave the field of ideas and enter the deepest place of your life. The Word clearly confirms this in Psalm 34:4. "I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He has delivered me from all my fears." This is not just a distant promise. It is an accessible reality. There is a point where the search finds answer, where fear finds liberation, where the mind finds rest. This is the time to open your heart without reservation, to stop just reflecting and start living this truth. It's not about perfect words, it's about sincere surrender. Now bring everything before God, every thought, every fear, every area that needs transformation, trusting that He is present and ready to act. Beloved Father, your word declares in Philippians 4:7 that your peace surpasses all understanding, and it is in this promise that we place ourselves now, opening our hearts before your presence, trusting that you are here, hearing, seeing, and acting in every invisible detail of our mind and soul. We thank you, Lord, for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching, for every truth that has brought light where there was once confusion, for every direction that has begun to rearrange thoughts that were lost. Thank you that you do not leave us trapped in fear, but lead us to a new way of thinking based on your truth. Now, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom. Strengthen each person who is praying at this moment. Give courage to face what once seemed impossible. Release discernment to recognize your voice above any internal noise, and establish a firm faith that is not shaken by circumstances. Let every mind here be sustained by a real confidence, not based on what one sees, but on what the Lord has already declared. Lord, reach now every area of need. It touches those who are emotionally tired, bringing true rest. It visits those who face anxiety, constant fear, racing thoughts, and establishes peace. It releases healing on illnesses, both physical and invisible. It opens doors for those who need financial provision, arranges paths where there is confusion, restores families that are broken, brings reconciliation where there has been estrangement, and spiritually strengthens those who feel weak. At this moment, in silence, each heart presents before you what it has not been able to express in words. Each hidden pain, each stored fear, each deepest request. Father, we commend everything into your hands. We surrender our thoughts, our worries, our future, our innermost fears. We set before you that which we cannot control, trusting that you have absolute dominion over all things. In Jesus' name, every structure of fear is broken, every lie is undone, and we declare that every mind here is being aligned with your truth, as it is written in 2 Corinthians 10:5, taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. May your peace rule. May your voice be stronger than any contrary thought. And may from now on there be a new reality being established within each one. We trust, Father, that you are already doing something new, and we rest in that assurance. If this prayer expresses what is in your heart, write Amen and declare that truth as a mark of faith. In Jesus' name, Amen. Throughout this journey, something has become deeply and undeniably clear. Fear has never been just a passing emotion, but a structure that tries to dominate the mind, distort the vision, and limit the destination. But every teaching, every story, every word revealed showed that God doesn't just treat the symptoms, it goes straight to the root. It confronts, breaks, reconstructs, and completely transforms the way of thinking. From Eden to the cross, from the prophets to the disciples, one truth repeats itself. When the mind aligns itself with God's voice, fear loses its power. And this message is for you, not by chance, not by coincidence. God chose you to hear that today. Now the question that remains is, will you continue to allow fear to dictate your thoughts, or will you decide to align your mind with the truth that sets you free? I'm very happy that we're together so far, because this isn't just a video. It's a meeting. There's something special going on, and you're a part of it. I want to invite you, in a simple and sincere way, to strengthen this connection. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and activate the bell to continue receiving these messages. But more than that, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you are watching and, if you feel in your heart, share what you have been facing. Your story matters, your journey matters, and together we can create a chain of faith where lives are touched and transformed. And it doesn't stop here. What you heard today is just the beginning of something much bigger. In the next video, we will delve even deeper into this understanding, revealing how to live daily under this renewed mind and how to maintain this peace even in the midst of challenges. There is a next step waiting for you, a new revelation that can further expand what God has already begun to do within you now. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life and see you in the next video.